tutor, Steve Dwoskin, who was one of the founder members of the London Film Cooperative, American, New York, designer and filmmaker. And he had an apartment at Denby Road, and he was leaving that, and he passed it over to me, and which was really nice. So my final year at college, I was living at Denby Road in Notting Hill, and that was kind of chill. That time was getting more and more involved in community action activities, and I was at the LCP, as I say, which was a real hotbed of socialists. A lot of students seemed to have fairly kind of radical activities outside college. And one of the students introduced me to George Clark, who wanted a designer for the magazine he was starting called People and Politics. And so I art edited a magazine for him. Not quite sure how many issues, but pretty soon I became involved with the London Free School through George and met Hoppy. And Hoppy asked me to design style stuff for the London Free School. And so I ended up doing this ampersand device that expressed the idea of a workshop free school activity that offered a lot of things. So the reason for the "and" is to express that fact that there were many things that you could do through the London Free School as it grew, as it would grow. People bring their expertise to the local community and offer all kinds of skills. I ended up working for Hoppy whilst in my final year at college, going over to his apartment in Queensway, which was an amazing apartment, because it just seemed like the centre of the universe at that time. I don't know if Hoppy's talked about it much, but anybody seemed to come through there from all over, especially from America. People were always coming and going through that place, and I helped him put together the Grove, local newspaper for the Notting Hill area, which was part of the activities of London Free School and the idea of setting up the Notting Hill Fair towards the end of '66. Hoppy asked me to become art director of International Times, which had just been started. I became part of the team that produced the first. I suppose I worked there till about issue 13 or 14.
Yeah.
Till, just soon after the raid, and I think there was definitely a very big interest, and I certainly had it at that time in the kind of drug culture for states of consciousness and in what state of consciousness you would be in by taking drugs. That moved on a little later to me, out of drugs and into mysticism, into spiritual sort of ideas. I met, can't exactly remember the point when I met Dudley, but I know that Dudley came along one day and he had an interest in this mystic called Mir Baba, and said there was a meeting, there was a Baba meeting being held at the Poetry Society in Earl's Court, and would I like to come along? I think he tried to interest Paul McCartney to come along.
Really?
This is when Dudley was living with Paul McCartney, when Jane Asher had gone to America to do an acting tour, and I think Paul had Dudley staying with him as a sort of, to fill the empty house.
Right.
But Dudley came along one day and said, "Look, there's this meeting, come along." And so I went along, and it was really interesting. There was something about Western ideas in religion which I didn't like, and as I expressed, I think that sense at that time where the interest was in a kind of more feminine approach to the world, that the spiritual ideas and the mystical ideas of the Far East were much more of interest and seemed to capture more the kind of sense and the feeling of the time, very much. And that kind of talk came about through with Dudley, talking with him, which led to the visit to the Poetry Society in Earl's Court, which led to Dudley coming and staying with me and Kate, my first wife, at the apartment in Shaftesbury Avenue. And Dudley and I starting up this design group called On Tentacle. A short time we worked together, but certainly the two posters that we did for Jazz at the Roundhouse and La Fenêtre Rose, the psychedelic show in Paris, were more about expressing the idea of God than about the events. I'm not sure that I saw as much liberation as I thought I would do. And I suppose it's just part of the hypocrisy of just being human, I suppose. But one did feel at the time, with the attitudes and the ideas that were being expressed and the way we talked about sexual liberation, we were talked about a new relationship between men and women, it was very difficult to sense that that was happening. And I suppose, I don't know, it was a very odd, it was an odd manifestation of the liberation, I suppose, was the kind of shortening of the skirt. Because at the same time as you were trying to, I suppose, see women as friends and as partners in life, you were getting turned on by the way they looked, because the stuff they were wearing was just so much more provocative. In the 60s there was a moment, and it was a nice moment, when one talked about this culture of love, where the dialogue about love could expand and become much richer and broader, and not just be about sex, which would be nice. And R.D. Laing was somewhere central in all that. He had some nice things and interesting things to say about love, and especially the complexity. And so I just think the whole debate about what love is and the complexity of it and talking about it more just wasn't allowed to happen. And I think it just degenerated back into the old sexual cliche. We had a party at our apartment, and Pete came along after, I think he'd been down to see Frank Zappa in Soho, and was doing the Flying Dragon with Dudley at that time. We were working on the sketches for it, and Pete and I sat down, and just he was talking about the experiences he'd been going through, and he had a lot of these kind of ideas in his head about UFOs and drugs and mysticism, and lots of ideas. He enjoys talk, and I enjoy talk, and so I was saying, there's this guy Mayor Barber, because by that time I'd kind of been going along to meetings and got to read a bit about Barber, and it kind of connected with what people said. So I gave him a book, Godman, and he went away and read it, and then we met up on a number of occasions with Karen and Pete and me and Kate, and would go over to their apartment and come to ours, and just a friendship grew out of this shared interest in Barber. And we certainly in '67, when we met up, there was a lot of talk about Barber, and the Barber group grew in '67, and we were holding meetings in Soho at Pete's apartment studio he had at that time, and there were kind of discussion groups, and a lot of ideas coming out of that, and the occasional mentor would come in, like Don Stevens, an American Barber lover, an older generation, and would talk to us about Barber's teachings. And one thing or another, there was a lot of chat, and at that time I think Pete had, towards the end of '67, was developing kind of ideas of a mini opera, but for something else. I think Barber was helpful in the sense that it glued a lot of these pieces together. and gave a frame and a shape to the experiences that his principal character would be going through,
Sure.
and why he would be going through that stuff, and in what way the experience would be illuminating what in the character, and what the fall would be, you know, and I think that was kind of important, the arc of the narrative, you know,
Right,
in
yeah.
terms of the rise and the fall. Well, I suppose because it's music, and that's very hard to make pictures for,
Right.
without it just being abstract, you know,
Right.
because music is a natural abstract form. But luckily it was an opera, so
Yeah.
it had a libretto,
Yeah.
and that and also the lovely thing about it, and the thing that really made it work for me, it was because it was another Barber lover. Pete's opera had Barber seeped into it, and it was a very nice project to take on because it was a Barber project.
Yeah.
And so the difference there in terms of commissioning was just that it was just a sweet commission, because it was with a friend. It was a friend who you shared ideas with, and it was a creative idea that I felt a part of. The whole point of Tommy Cover was that it was meant to be a field and ground illusion. You know? And so when you see the thing as a 12-inch record cover, that's a way in which you view it, and the field and ground illusion is enhanced by when you open it. I needed to create something which could be more symbolic moments,
Yeah.
and pick up on the kind of symbolism of the moments through the narrative, and create symbolic pictures.
Yeah.
That sort of could be just you know, I suppose little psychological, philosophical kind of moments in the story. And so the cover and the inside cover are these ways of expressing perhaps the state or the world that Tommy's in. And then the outside is kind of the universe. It hints at endless space, which might be the kind of space that's inside this child that can't see, touch, you know, hear or speak. Whereas the inside is this domestic space. It's the wall, the room that we all live in.
Right.
And that's our condition. We live in a room, and we also live in this endless universe that we know no edges to.